Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Rubrik. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I will be moderating today's session. We have an exciting presentation ahead of us, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the discussion, it will be made available to rewatch. You will receive an email after the webinar concludes with a link to access the on-demand. We want to hear from you, so please feel free to send in your questions at any time throughout the program using the Q&A feature. We will try to address as many questions as we can, so be sure to get your questions in early. We also encourage you to talk with us using the chat tab. Let us know your thoughts or just say a quick hello. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we will host a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Stick around to see if you're one of our 4 lucky winners. Let's go ahead and kick off our webinar. The topic today, modern ransomware, how we got here, and where we're going. I'm joined today by Jason Cook, Director for Major Sales Engineering at Rubrik. Jason, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Cody, and I appreciate the dialogue before we got started. It's good to get to know you, my friend. And hello, everyone in virtual space. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit about certainly Rubrik's point of view, right? But I will do my level best to temper our perspective with as much of what's happening at a macro level out in the world as it relates to cyber events, particularly ransomware. I know you guys have a lot of choice in webinars these days. Certainly the pandemic, whatever mode we're in or phase we're in, are we post-pandemic? I'm not quite sure. I don't think we'll ever know, but there's certainly choice, and we appreciate you choosing us. So with that having been said, as Cody noted, I handle the sales engineering, which means the technical sellers for the major accounts, which are effectively the Fortune 100 for Rubrik. I've been with Rubrik for just about 5 years, and I can tell you what's very interesting is when I started with Rubrik, our aim was to do a few things. One, it was obviously to modernize an application that had long since lacked any innovation or significant innovation, that being backup and recovery. And then the other thing through that process, it was to bring cost savings, operational savings, and as well, cloud enablement, right? So for folks who hadn't quite gotten started with their public cloud journey, they, looking at adopting solutions where they could do that easily, Rubrik really fit that bill. But as the years went by, the shift happened, and it seemed like it happened overnight and very, very quickly. I'm here to tell you that the number one reason why people, our customers, people we're talking to as prospective customers, and frankly, anybody these days is reimagining, reevaluating backup and recovery is because of ransomware, right? And I'm going to talk to you about why that is. And then I'm going to talk to you about how Rubrik is delivering a defensible solution as it relates to companies being able to survive and securely and responsibly and quickly come back from such an attack. I would say it is the most important mission that Rubrik is focused on today, and I'm delighted to share that perspective, as well as some best practices ideas that, irrespective of whether you evaluate Rubrik or backup and recovery at all, there are some general covenants about how to protect data that I think have changed as a result of ransomware. And then, I'd like to do a little bit of a quick product demonstration just to put a visualization to what it is we offer, and point out and highlight some concepts that I'll talk about in the presentation, just by way, again, of visual demonstration and/or, an easier way with pictures, essentially, to highlight the concepts. So let's jump in. And I want to start us off by setting some context. And the context is, as we're out dialoguing with various organizations, whatever vertical they may be, because I think everybody essentially had this problem, whether you manufacture cardboard boxes, you deliver healthcare services to people, you are in big financial, it doesn't really matter. Data essentially is our intellectual property these days. It is our competitive, edge the applications and the IT services that we deliver. So I think this issue is very ubiquitous. And if you look at the state of ransomware, you see that there really isn't a specific sort of persona or group or organization or business that's targeted. They're all targeted. And so when we're dialoguing with folks, we're trying to frame what's top of mind and really get into understanding, hey, what's your perspective, whether it be at a board level or a more tactical or operational level? What are you trying to address as it relates to this area of IT? And there's three things. The first one is data security, which I think is incredibly germane to the ransomware issue itself. And that is to say, all right, well, how quickly, in fact, can I recover from ransomware, right? Because let's face it, there are many types of cyber attacks, there are many types of cyber events, but I think that one in particular, just given its nature, it exfiltrates, it infiltrates, it compromises security databases, it does so many different things. It's arguably one of the most sophisticated and chaotic attacks out on the market, and so or out in the world. So from that perspective, that really is when we talk about cyber attacks, is to narrow it down, is what we're talking about, right? And then as it relates to that, people want to have a strategy for automating the management of data, particularly around applications that touch most or all of their data, like backup does. That's one of the reasons why our founders built our platform on that technology or on that concept, is because we believe that backup, the app backing up, and the nature of that application is such that it touches all of the applications in the data center, certainly the ones that are critical, wherever that data center may be, whether it's in the public cloud, on premises, or whatever. It kind of doesn't matter. It's a ubiquitous idea. The other thing too was to implement automation, given the nature of our technology, which is based on RESTful API, so that you could kind of get rid of the human intervention element to so many things, particularly getting a handle on what is being protected and what isn't, and not really relying on a human to interface with that conundrum or with that problem, i.e. I need to understand what the application is and all the components in order to get it into the backup application so it'll be protected. So that if we could put automation into that solution, we could remove that issue, which certainly has a transitive benefit of helping ensure that things are protected and thereby recoverable in the event of a cyber breach. And then last, public cloud. How do I get there? But more importantly, how do I get there securely? Because the same controls, whether they be different in tactical execution, but the same conceptual controls about how I manage and secure data on premises have to be consistent wherever that data happens to live. And I think, at least in my travels, that to me has always been or tended to be the barrier of entry as it relates to, hey, this is how we get to public cloud, or this is kind of the thought process for how we will navigate that, is how we ensure that we're not exposing ourselves or growing our risk posture by doing that. So it's the sanctity of knowing that you've got end-to-end security as you kind of go throughout that. So, with that having been said, what we're seeing right now is this problem that's arisen. And that is very simply that in the enterprise application set and in the enterprise sort of IT landscape, wherever the data is served, you have this fundamental issue, which is these ransomware attacks are getting through all the known layers of IT security that we're commonly used to, or familiar with, and that we've invested heavily in: perimeter security, network security, endpoint, application, et cetera. And they found a way to target the data specifically, right? So what that means is, as I said at the outset, the most important issue of our time is to ensure that we have the safety and the sanctity of knowing that our data is protected, i.e. the backups or the backups we're taking, and that they can be recovered quickly, right? Because at the end of the day, if you look at all the notable ransomware attacks, that has been the issue, is that current backup application architectures very often will write to open storage mounts or open file system or NFS or SMB shares. And that is like a honeypot, if you will, or, like a Glengarry lead for a ransomware or a cyber criminal. It's a place where they really can sink their teeth into, because they can encrypt the data, they can delete the data, they can remove it. And of course, if production is compromised, so too are the backups. Well, that becomes an unrecoverable event, right? So to walk through this, and I'm just going to pause for 1 second, folks, and take a look at something really, really quick, just to make sure I'm sharing this out to you all correctly. Let me just make sure here. All right. Okay, good. So what we see is this from a sort of operational, reality, and this is the context that we want to set, because I think it's pretty much known in the marketplace that, hey, this is how ransomware works. But I'll be honest, a lot of times we have conversations and people are a little less familiar with that process, right, and where they're exposed. So obviously, the first step post-attack is the organization has a decision to make. In our experience, that tends to be roughly 12 to 24 hours, right? So you don't have a lot of time to decide, hey, do I have good backups? Do I understand what patient zero is? Do I know what my blast radius is? Do I know what was impacted? Do I know how to respond effectively? Whom do I communicate to, right? Which is something I'm going to get into later, is the reason why it's so critical to have a ransomware recovery plan, because I think it is just that much different than a traditional data center or a DR or a business continuity plan, in that the concept of having such a plan is the same, but the nuances and the sort of who needs to be notified and what the process is different. And it's really important that you tabletop and practice that recovery exercise often, so you've got a handle on, okay, this is how we will respond. And I think what happens is that when most people get breached, they're so on their hind legs as it relates to being able to respond, because they've not tabletop, they don't really have a plan to respond to this, and or simply the backups have been compromised, for example, and they don't have anything to recover from, pay the ransom, right? And so often folks have invested in cyber insurance. And so they kind of have a pivot that they can go to help them do that. Well, I'll be honest, these days that's becoming a loss leader for insurance companies. If you read a lot of the articles out there, I happen to have a family member who's in insurance. And we often talk about this situation, and what he recounted to me was that, hey, in the very early days, well before ransomware, cyber insurance was very profitable because the risk margin was very, very low. The odds that somebody would breach you or attack you in such a chaotic way, like ransomware does, were very, very few and far between. So it was a way to make premium with very little risk of payout. Well, ransomware has completely flipped that on its head. And right now, this puts your insurance companies in precarious positions, because especially for large organizations, these payouts are multiple, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars. The CNA example, $40 million ransomware. So with that having been said, they're really reassessing the covenants that go into getting cyber insurance. And they're starting to, bring in a lot of these terminologies that I'll talk about in a minute, in order to ensure that organizations are meeting key criterion as it relates to being able to defensively respond if in the event that they're breached. And so what that means is that organizations are having to pivot to go make investments to deal with this. The other thing that's happening is premiums are going up, and then payout maximums are lowering. And ransomware isn't just about recovering the data. It's about communicating a response, particularly if you're publicly traded. It's about assessing your exposure for your regulatory bodies in terms of what fines that you might pay. And there's a lot of factors. There's hiring companies like Mandiant who have to come in and do cyber forensics to really help you understand what's there, what's not there, build a clean environment. There's a lot of costs and time that go into that. So, even something like a $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 million cyber insurance plan may not be enough, depending on the size of your organization. But what we're finding is that insurance companies are really lowering those maximums. So, if you're an organization who believes that, hey, I've got backups and I have tested them and I can recover, what we find is okay, that process gets kicked off once the understanding of the breach happens. And typically what'll begin that process is a reach out to a couple of different factions or groups within IT who very often are not all that connected. They only get connected when something like this occurs. Those two groups are IT operations and security operations. IT, because they're the stewards of the data, and most often the backup application, that which would beget or handle all of the recoveries. And then security operations is trying to help IT determine what got impacted, right? And then there's a sort of a third group, less technical, more business and compliance, but governance, risk, and compliance, the GRC team. They have to understand, because they're going to have to handle communications and responses and look at their risk posture in terms of what fee or fines the organization may be levied as a result of the breach, etc. So all these things are sort of happening in parallel, right? But there's some key questions that need to get answered as a part of that. Not just can I recover, but also do I know what to recover? And then how fast can that go? Because if the answer is I don't know and or too long, you're going to pay the ransom, right? So what Rubrik believes is that you need a comprehensive strategy to address all of that. And it can't just be any one thing. It really is the confluence of factors. It starts certainly with the core platform, right? The sanctity of knowing that your backups are safe, they live in an air-gapped and immutable format. But it's also authentication controls, right? Expiry controls, right? And then a layering on a rich set of analytics, a tool set that can help you infer, hey, has data been encrypted? Are there patterns in the data which infer some kind of cyber event or breach? Because they're using machine learning and AI to just determine or standardize on a baseline, and then kind of use that as the go forward to compare to. And then the other thing is that, from a GRC perspective, can I glean from the backups? Is there sensitive material out in those backups, which, if they're exfiltrated, put us at serious risk, right? And a lot of times what happens, at least in our experience, is, we put that tool on for our customers and they say, oh, I didn't know that was there. I didn't know we had PII here, or we didn't know we had PCI here, or et cetera. And it's, the intelligence, being able to shine a spotlight on that is a great way to take a first step to remediating it and also limiting your exposure, right? And then last but not least, it's having the automation that I spoke on earlier to be able to, really respond quickly to mass recovery, if that's something that you need to do, right? At the same time, having the granularity of recovery is also key, because what we see sometimes in these ransomware responses is that the company is so overwhelmed with the amount of data they think they have to recover because they're not exactly sure, they pivot to pay the ransom because they think the decryptor utility will be faster. And very often it isn't. They're sad to find out that it's not as fast as they thought it was going to go, and it puts them behind. So that, as I go through this, is really the sort of bedrock or the lens architecturally that we're looking through, because this is the problem, or series of problems that we're looking to solve. So for us, or for our customers, and I encourage everyone to go out to our website and look at our proof points. You just go to rubrik.com/ransomware. You'll see, all these different testimonials. There's a great one from a building supply company where they talk about, hey, this is the anatomy of what happened, and this is how with Rubrik this all played out, right? We were able to determine what was attacked, right? The platform was secure, the data was there. We were able to get back quickly because of Rubrik's on-platform recovery technology, and we saved ourselves the ransom. And that ultimately is what this really comes down to, is, we want to defensively help you not pay the bad guys. And I think that, it really is a architectural point of view that we're offering. And that is this, that, there's a core platform that lives anywhere, cloud, data center, what have you. And then there's a software as a service application framework that layers on top of it as the control plane, right? And the reason why we believe that that's essential is because we want to be able to deliver not just core data protection or backup and recovery capabilities and do that securely. We also want to have all of these rich analytics and, more data management capabilities on top of that. But what we also want is a platform where we can iterate quickly, and delivering something in a software as a service. I mean, pretty much everybody these days consumes some kind of SaaS, M365, Salesforce, ServiceNow, et cetera. And I think that model is so important, is because it allows organizations or companies like a Rubrik to iterate really quickly, which benefits the client, you, because we can get out new capabilities and services or upgrades to current capabilities and service much faster than being bound to a device, a box, right? Or something that has to be changed out in order to get new capabilities. So all these things you see here on the screen are an essential part of that, right? And that's the architecture and the framework that we've built. And to shift gears a little bit into the core platform, I want to share this information because I think it's important to differentiate us and why we think what we're offering is so important to solving this ransomware conundrum. And it really starts at the foundation of the core platform, right? And there's a lot of services that I can point to here and talk about in detail, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just a couple. Number one is essentially what Rubrik is doing is collecting vast amounts of metadata about your data, right? The data that we're protecting, right? And that's handled by Callisto, the metadata service. Why is that important? Because it's exactly how we leverage that metadata that provides us the capabilities that I'll talk about in a minute, or that I've inferred earlier about encryption detection, anomalous pattern detection, et cetera, sensitive material detection and alerting. We use the metadata. We don't mount a workload and scan it. We don't send the data to the public cloud and scan it, right? We're not waiting this time to really get the payload up somewhere so that we can give the end user a result in terms of what's happening. We're using the metadata, which means it's very, very lightweight, which is why we can give a response as it relates to those items I covered earlier, the encryption, anomaly, what have you, sensitive material, within 30 minutes of the backup, right? That's unique capability, because the time it takes to get this result back is so important, especially when you're talking about a ransomware response, so no matter whether you're using Rubrik or not, I think that should be a key sort of required capability. How fast can I get a result on what's happening in the data, particularly the copy data, which is most likely touching every application in the data center. The other thing I want to note here too is the very file system, right? Rubrik scratch built a file system. We're not licensing anybody's file system. We built our very own. And the idea with the Rubrik file system was to accomplish two goals. One, to keep the backup separate and away from the network, so we do not exist or we are not accessible via known storage protocols like NFS or SMB. And then the other thing would be to make the platform, however, available on the network so we could do rapid recoveries. So you got to kind of straddle those two lines, right? So that's why we built the file system the way we did. There's a portion of the file system which is logically separated that receives incoming data from source applications that we're protecting, and that happens over secure socket connections, again, not SMB or NFS. And then once those patches or those changes or that data is written, that connection is closed, and then the writing into what we call the blob store happens, and that writing is all done via a non-routable API, which is only known to Rubrik. So from the end-to-end process, all of the steps of securing that information, whether it be hashing, fingerprinting, CRCing, etc., happen. But as well, there is at no point where that file system is exposed to the network in some kind of a read-writable format. The very file system itself is immutable. It's append only. So if you think as a snapshot or a backup timeline, it only moves forward. And so at least in terms of alteration, it's also exists in a native format, which means even through some act of, statistical improbability, crazy supercomputer, whatever it is, they managed to figure out how to crack the internal non-routable API, which is, I would argue, in the tens of millions to one kind of statistical probability strata. The data would be illegible because it's not in a native format, right? And I think that's really important. So you're doing this evaluation, like, all right, how is the architecture built, and how can I know that, hey, the data will be safe if in the event there's a breach, because it can't be gotten to through most means. And then How fast will I be able to recover it? Can I recover it on platform, or do I have to do data transfers, or is it even lengthier? Something like a tape. Our logic layer, really important too, right? How we handle, the management of data, how we handle expiration, how we handle dedupe and compression, right? The efficiency pieces are really, really important because when it comes to doing recoveries post-event, you want the safety and the sanctity of knowing that data is intact, right? But it's also stored efficiently, so it's not a high cost. And then searchability, so everything we do is we try to make it as user friendly as humanly possible, and that rests on search, because you're in a serious cyber event. You don't want to have to go tree navigating to really kind of figure out and rescanning catalogs and all of that kind of stuff. We don't have any of those concepts in our architecture. So the Hawkeye service, for example, handles all of that, right? And all of these connections, all these pathways are done, uniquely, securely. They're fingerprinted, hashed, etc. So that's how we maintain, or part of how we maintain, a zero trust architecture within our software stack, right? And then last but not least, the interface layer. And I think this is very important because it's not a separate construct as it relates to the core platform. There's nothing you install. There's no management, UI that you have to deploy or whatever. It's native to the software stack. You simply point your browser to Rubrik, and the UI renders itself, which is nothing more than an HTML5 call out to the REST APIs that belie our solution, right? And the interface layer allows us to do other things like connect to public cloud entities or targets. It allows us to integrate with ecosystem platforms, VMware, storage, etc. All done through a lens of security. All those connections are encrypted, they are unique, they're socket-based, etc. And the design there is, no matter where the data flows, it's end-to-end secured. So, particularly as it relates to ransomware, there's a few principles that keep coming up. And as I was talking about earlier, you're going to start to see these, and this is happening now in cyber insurance questionnaires. And that's even for existing customers. The insurance company coming back and saying, "Hey, do you have these factors or these capabilities within your data protection solution? Because what we know is these are the most defensible features, right? In order to say that at the very least, the data itself is protected. There's more, which I'll get to, but this is kind of where it starts. And the first one is air gapping. And I alluded to that earlier, talked about it from our architectural perspective. We built something we call the logical air gap, which again is the backups are not available on the network, but the platform is, right? The problem with disconnected, or really offline vaults or gaps or what have you is the restoration time it takes. Take tape, for example. One would argue the best air gap out there. The challenge with it is the time it takes to do that restoration, especially for big organizations where we're talking high data volumes, right? It's just not tenable. It's a pathway to paying the ransom. So, the trick is I've got to have it online. It just has to live in a format that's not accessible using the means that most ransomware, really all ransomware attacks would focus on, right? And then the next piece is ensuring that the file system itself, or the place where the data is stored, lives in a non-native format, right? And certainly not in a read-writable file system, i.e. a storage share, right? Or an NFS export, right? The very definition of immutable is that it can't be edited, right? You can only add to it. You can't take away from it. And then take the extra step, which is it exists in a native or a non-native format where you can't read it, right? It's not legible to, known applications like, Windows Explorer or something. And then last but not least, it's expiration controls, being able to prevent things like system time adjustments, where, we've seen this happen in ransom attacks where they come in, the backup application is running on Windows, they change the system time to the year 2050, and then what do you know? The backup app thinks it's time to expire all the backups, right? Or, there's a worm policy assigned to a given set of data. there's an authentication hack, right? Or the Windows OS is compromised, or somebody's gotten login credentials, a variety of different vectors, but they actually log into the backup application and they start to expire backups, right? Because they have the appropriate administrative privileges. What Rubrik built in Retention Lock prevents both of those things. One is with Retention Lock, an admin can't disable it. One is once it's been disabled, only Rubrik support can. And the organization has to call in with 2 members of the business that are not technical and go through a series of questions to get that work done. Because let's face it, it will happen. But the fact is you want those extra security controls to prevent a rogue admin or bad actor logging in, compromising the system, and just removing the legal hold or the worm or the retention lock and going ahead and deleting the backups, because this has happened. So retention lock in and of itself with Rubrik stops deletion right in its tracks, because there's certainly no way to do that, even if you have the appropriate privileges. So it's those 3 things that really have to be table stakes when you go to do your evaluation, certainly on your core system, but whatever it is that you're looking to acquire, if you recognize you need to do something else. So, if you look at, all right, if I have air gapping and immutability as a sort of, bedrock covenant in my core architecture, then you can move forward defensively with at least that the data itself is protected, and there's controls to do that. Because without it, the world looks like this. Ransomware comes in and not only attacks the production systems, but the backup systems too, because so often in traditional backup architectures, those things would be installed on Microsoft Windows. Very vulnerable platform, if not secured properly, etc. And once those systems are arrested, now they can get at the backup application and begin to wreak havoc. The other approach is straight to the storage target, right? If it's writing over known storage protocols like NFS and SMB, all of the evidence on the ransomware scene, if you will, shows that is an attack vector. It's an easy one at that, and it's a place where folks can either encrypt or delete the backups straight away, right? And essentially what happens is now that all of the known recovery mechanisms are covered, in a bad way, a major attack now becomes an unrecoverable event, right? With Rubrik, right, because you have the factors of air gapping and immutability built in, right, from the first copy, which I think is critically important, right? Essentially what happens is that as the attack comes in, right, number one, they can't get at the backups themselves, right? There's no way to modify that data in any way, shape, or form, either access it or modify it, because of the native air gapping and because of the immutability. So essentially what that means is now a major attack is a recoverable event and from the first copy, i.e. the copy that Rubrik took and has on its system, right? But it really isn't just that, right? And I want to underscore this, right? Because the how did we get here, as our seminar here suggests, is because these controls aren't in place, right? It's not a holistic sort of, defense in depth view that most folks have and the market has had around backup and recovery. I think now, because the words like immutability and air gapping are becoming more ubiquitous across the landscape, and even folks like insurance companies are using those words, the thought is, if I have immutability and I have air gapping, I'm good. I can check the box. It just isn't true. Like, securing your data is no different than securing your perimeter. It's an act of defense in depth, right? So number one, that does begin with a core platform. You've got to have all of the elements, right? From end-to-end encryption to zero trust architecture, like I outlined with our software stack. The other thing is you've got to have authentication controls. I mean, this ultimately is the one thing that will keep you from paying the bad guys and having, a serious financial event as a result of the ransomware, reputation, brand damage, or whatever. What we're finding is that as more and more companies get to immutable storage, they get to air gapping, and they don't have a plan for authentication controls, they're just as vulnerable, because many ransomware attacks will compromise Active Directory and other authentication databases. And if you don't have things like multi-factor authentication enabled and integrated with your backup application, then you are susceptible to such a breach. I mean, let's face it, as consumers of financial services, each and every one of us has a bank account, at least most of us do. And, I think a key criteria for banking these days is, does that bank offer multi-factor authentication? I certainly wouldn't bank with somebody who doesn't do that, because just a username and password just isn't enough, right? And to that point, what Rubrik decided to do is build our own. I mean, me personally, I feel like it's only a matter of time before the duos and somebody's going to figure out a breach for those, right? And so the next layer of defense in depth, particularly for what we would argue now in a ransomware context, are the crown jewels, your backups, would be to have its own authentication database, i.e. local accounts on the backup system itself, secured by some other multi-factor mechanism, right? And we built one, right? We use a time-based one-time password approach with an authenticator app. So it's something username and password, and something you have your device with that authenticator app running. You punch in a code and you're able to log in, right? The retention lock, I talked about that, as expiry control, right? The idea that once that's enabled, it can't be disabled, right? And it automatically prevents deletion as a result of that. Even a privileged admin can't do that without Rubrik's support intervention. It's a key nuance, because if you have an authentication compromise, somebody logs into your backup system, they can disable those controls. And now that door is now open, right? And there's no gate, there's no other control that comes down to prevent access, right? And that really is the approach we took with our retention lock. The other thing is, as it relates to expiry controls, is things like Ntp poisoning prevention, right? So there's a lot of applications out there that are using the system time to determine, hey, this is what expiry means, et cetera, or how to expire snapshots or backups. The problem with that is that if somebody can spoof that time or simply change it through a compromise, well, the backup system will act accordingly and begin removing backups. Rubrik uses a monotonic clock, and you can Google that. The idea is that it uses, it actually counts the minutes, the seconds, the hours, the days, and keeps track of that tally to determine expiration, as opposed to just whatever the system time says. So just those little nuances, but that's the defense in depth strategy that I'm talking about, which really gives the end user the sanctity of knowing, like, hey, core platform is impervious to breach no matter which way they try it. So it's this confluence of factors that come together that give you a platform you can count on, right? Particularly in your time of need. So, the next step beyond the core platform, right, would be those analytics that I talked about at the beginning. Being able to see, to really infer what's happened, what's the scope, what's my risk posture, and then it triggers all of the things, right? Is it benign? Is it serious? Whom do I need to communicate with? It gives you an opportunity to have more intelligence about how I'm going to, or should I, or when I execute my recovery plan, right? So we built that application framework, runs in a software as a service model. It's called Polaris. And what Polaris does is it serves as a sort of bedrock for various services and applications that we've written on top of them. One of them we call Radar. And what Radar is designed to do is, just as you see on the screen, to look for patterns and facts about the data, right? Using machine learning and advanced artificial intelligence to create a baseline understanding of a given data set or given backup and the data within it, and then to pattern that over time. So we can see, like, hey, can we mark this activity as suspicious, right? And why? And it isn't pattern based, right? It uses these advanced, algorithmic techniques in order to get at these results, right? So it helps eliminate false positives. It also gives you a real sense of, true suspicious activity as opposed to, more benign things. The other thing is having the granularity of assessment is key. Like, again, irrespective of what system you choose or whatever, just as a general best practice, you want something that can really get down in there. Don't just tell me, these things changed since the last backup, but really tell me at a file level what's different. What has happened, most particularly encryption. Are these files encrypted? I can't think of a better way to infer a ransomware attack, either one that's already occurred or one that's about to occur, is files that are encrypted. Again, we're using that metadata to determine that. So that result, or that knowledge is so important, right? And then to be able to deliver that within 30 minutes of a backup, is super important, because the faster you can get at it, the more quickly you can be actionable upon that, right? And it'll reduce your time to recovery. And then last but not least, you want to factor in this correlative connection between the event, that which was compromised or that which is suspicious and needs to be recovered, to automation, which allows you to recover that data quickly, right? And then the second piece is an application we wrote called Sonar. And what Sonar's job is to look through the data and, using the same sort of constructs of machine learning and AI, to say, okay, what is my sensitive material posture based on my compliancy and regulatory bodies that I adhere to? So if you're financial or you're retail or whatever, and you do credit card transactions, that's PCI, right? If you're a global company, your GDPR, right? If you're healthcare, your HIPAA, et cetera. So we devised this tool with a series of analyzers that address those particular compliancy bodies right out of the box, right? You simply turn it on, little checkbox, boom, it scans the data, and it's doing so in real time after the backups have occurred, and you get the result. And it tells you, hey, listen, I've got these hits based on these analyzers within the data set. And then if you want to create some custom ones that you want to do your own regular expressions or your own dictionary definitions, we allow you to do that too, right? So essentially what's happening here is now I also have a way of understanding my sensitive material exposure, which, ransomware attacks are also all about exfiltrating important IP, and they hold that data at ransom. With this tool set, I'm able to identify what that landscape is, right? And I can help, get a handle on what my risk posture is. Furthermore, I can do things like create honeypots. So I can kind of lure in the bad guys just to see what my risk posture is. You know what I mean? And so again, it's all of these things coming together, this confluence of capabilities, which makes, the best and arguably the most defensible approach to responding to such a cyber event like ransomware. Because again, you don't have a lot of time to do that when that occurs, especially once you've identified a major breach, right? Having tool sets like this, because we all know ransomware lives in the environment for some time before it generally will enact its big payload and leave that ransom node. Having tool sets like this gives you an opportunity to determine that activity before the big bang has happened, which again reduces exposure and recovery time. So if you're kind of looking at it from an assessment standpoint, even less so, this is our point of view, but more, hey, like, what would I be thinking about if I were to go and reevaluate where I sit today or where we sit as an organization? Number one is the data safe, right? Does it live on, a file share on a NAS machine, or does it live on a file share on a Windows server, right? Is it open, available, and exposed to the network? That's number one. So i.e., is it air gapped or not? Number two, if it lives on an open protocol or standard protocol file share, likely it is not immutable, right? So now I need to think about, all right, well, how would I implement that? And do I have what I need to do that? The next one is, do I have a mechanism for understanding what material has been encrypted, what's going on within my data to help me infer I've got something going on before it even occurs, right? And then is there a way to correlate that so that I can recover in mass based on what the system is telling me has been compromised? And then last, do I have a system or an application which can detect, hey, here's my sensitive material based on our definitions and our compliancy bodies, where are my exposures within the data that I've got, right? And I think if you've got the capability to do those three key things, right, with all of the controls I talked about in the core systems, right, that's how you're able to defensively respond. And essentially that's what we're offering here at Rubrik, right? So with the 7 minutes I've got left before we take questions, and I'm going to turn that back over to Cody. He'll moderate that at, I'm in Central Time, so 2:50. Before I get there, I wanted to just kind of do a real quick practical demonstration of our solution and just kind of, highlight and echo some of the things that I called out in the presentation, right? So first and foremost, from an authentication controls perspective, I want to show you the time-based one-time password approach to multi-factor that we've built, right? So when you first come into our core platform, right, this is where your backups and your restorations would occur. You're going to be presented with a username and password box pretty ubiquitous standard. But what's different is that what we're doing is we're leveraging our time-based one-type password technology to layer on a multi-factor authentication call to that very activity. So what I have here is my cell phone, and on that cell phone, it has an application installed. We support a variety of different ones, and we really just anything that can generate a 6-digit code. When you first set this up, you scan a QR code in your given application, and it kind of tacks up the revolving key. Right? I happen to be using Okta Verify because we use Okta from a single sign-on perspective, but you could use Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, 1Password. I think even LastPass works. Anything that will deliver or do a authentication generator, via QR code, right? So I'm going to punch in my little 6-digit code here and log into our system, right? And this is the place where now I would go and access our backups, right? And so just right then and there, just that simple control prevents 99% of all authentication attacks. That's what CrowdStrike reports and IDC and all of the analysts and think tanks out there talk about. Is just these simple little controls that, if they're built into the system, can give you the assuredness that, hey, you have to have these 2 factors as it relates to authenticating to look at the backups or do anything with the backups, not just username and password. So if somebody compromises your Active Directory, or they compromise somebody's LastPass or 1Password, right? Doesn't matter. They still have to have this factor to prevent access. So, certainly not a full demonstration, so I won't go over all the bells and whistles, but I do want to call out a few things. Number one, I talked about the immutability. I talked about the air gapping, right? I talked about kind of the nature of the system, right? I talked about the searchability, right? The fact that I can come into the system and look for things that I want to recover. For example, I can just kind of type in the name of my system, and all the things that I protect with it, it can go ahead and say, okay, well, here you go. Maybe we've got some databases, we've got some VMs, we've got some, this is all the systems, right? So it's very easy to get to. So if I had to do a recovery, right, in my time of need, I don't have to spend a lot of time hunting and pecking, and it's native to the system, right? I talked about the on-platform recoveries, right? So we'll use this virtual machine as an example. It's just as easy as going to a particular point in time and saying, hey, I want to mount this guy up. And what happens is it mounts that recovery right on the platform, right? So now this workload or this application or this VM is running right on Rubrik's compute and storage tier, right? So I'm not waiting for lengthy data transports to happen to get recoveries going up quickly, right? And just to kind of give you a snapshot into that, if you look at kind of the makeup of this particular environment, you can see it's this converged stack, right? Managed by this software, and you can provide the hardware, we can provide you the hardware. It doesn't really matter. It's all just x86 Intel-based stuff, pretty standard stuff. But the fact is that it all comes together to work in concert, and it scales out, which means the more you add to it, the more things that you can do. Most importantly, the more recoveries you can do. And that matters when it comes to ransomware. The fact that I can do, on-platform recoveries at scale, in mass, makes a huge difference in the time it takes to respond. And if you go to our website, you look at all our proof points, customers whom we've helped recover, that probably is the one and maybe most important thing that separates Rubrik and a good ransomware recovery strategy is the ability to get back quickly, particularly on platform, right? But let's take it away from the core platform. Right? Let's go into the application stack that I was talking about, the Polaris that's up on top, right? And what that does is that sits again as kind of think of it as a software as a service cloud control layer, right? Where we've got this orchestrator, right? This collector of information, if you will, across your entire landscape, right? If you will, a single pane of glass, and not my favorite term, but let's just call it that for now. So I use single sign-on product from Okta, right? And so you can integrate that with our solution. You can use multi-factor with this solution, right? Again, it all goes back to layering on as many authentication controls as you possibly can, right? So you want to be as multi-factored and multi control as you possibly can, right? When it comes to ensuring the sanctity of your information and your data. So to that point, right, that whole concept has got to be end to end. It can't be, it works over here, but it works over there, but it doesn't work over there. It's got to be end to end. So with this application, this is effectively what we're delivering is a cloud controller, right, which gives us all this capabilities, not just top-down visibility, right, but connectivity, secure connectivity into all of the different places where data may live, right? So for example, if it's on-premises applications, if it's cloud applications, if it's software as a service applications like M365 and SAP HANA, it doesn't really matter, right? We've built this sort of, transferable control plane to any data source. And the idea is we want to give organizations ultimate control over their IT and information landscape, because it's critically important when you look at securing it. And that radar application I talked about, right? The ability to get down into granular levels of detail to determine, hey, there's been a breach. There is suspicious activity going on in this particular application set. There is encrypted material, right? The ability to investigate it quickly and assess, right? And do recoveries en masse. For example, if I just want to say, hey, everything that's suspicious, let's go ahead and recover all of this information, right? And the system will determine what last known good is, right? And give you all these different recovery mechanisms for you to be able to do that, right? And do so securely, right? Also, when, if you've been breached, when Mandiant comes in, or your, tertiary cyber consultancy and response team comes in, you've got an easy way to get at known goods, so they can put that through the forensic filters just to make sure that in fact it is ransomware free. So folks, I really appreciate the time and to share this with you. And I really just, kind of hit with the tip of the iceberg. But this, I think, is the most important issue affecting not only organizations today, but arguably the economy. Ransomware and cyber criminals have a distinct ability to wreak havoc in small organizations, big organizations, right? And that will mean something for all of us. I mean, attacking logistics companies means we don't get our goods and services on time, right? Attacking airlines. I mean, there's so many different, risk factors and risk areas for us just as people in everyday life. So I think it's really important that, as a collective, we're looking at figuring out how we can solve this problem. And I'm glad to be able to share a little bit about how Rubrik is doing that. So with that, Cody, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll start fielding some questions.
Awesome, Jason. So our first question is asked by Paul, and Paul asks, does Rubrik offer in-office, hybrid, or remote training to help mitigate social engineering risks in addition to zero trust security solutions?
100%. So, generally, Paul, it would be in the context of an evaluation of or an implementation of Rubrik, because that is how we would discuss not only our zero trust implementation, but also weigh in on, based on your organization's, regulatory bodies, your risk posture, the GRC pieces, your audit controls, etc., what attack vectors you would be susceptible to, and then walk through and even help you develop a plan for responding to that, whether it be remediation, whether it be recovery, whether it be whatever, right? I'd even take it as far to say post-sale, you have what we call a rapid response team here at Rubrik, right? And so these folks are a team of people who work 24/7 and do nothing but help customers respond to cyber events, right? And so they'll set up war rooms, they'll get, all the different manufacturers and partners and consultants and whomever needs to come to the table to help an organization recover round the clock will do that. It's one of the reasons why we believe so much in our approach, Paul, to delivering all of this holistically, irrespective of where your data is, like you said, whether it's hybrid, public cloud, on-prem, doesn't matter. That we came out with a ransomware guarantee, right? We're offering organizations who become customers $5 million of cyber insurance should they be breached, to cover costs in addition to whatever they would have as a result of the event. So consulting fees, et cetera, because the data you're going to have, the recoveries you're going to have with Rubrik, and we're going to teach you how to do that. But in addition, we'll give you some real cost relief as it relates to, hey, helping you out of the jam.
Excellent. Our second question was asked by Steve. Steve asks, data mirror shielding and recovery solution has been recommended to mitigate ransomware risk. Does Rubrik use the same technique in essence for backup and recovery?
Yeah, at the backup layer though, right? In other words, mirroring is a concept which could be true for primary storage as well as it could be true for backup. I think the things that separate primary and backup is the place where you maintain a retention chain or a retention policy. So it tends to be longer periods of time. And that tends to be a function of whatever you're regulated by or what have you. But the notion that you can mirror, right, copies of Rubrik backups to other Rubrik deployments, whether they be in public cloud or on premises, is absolutely the fact. And as far as the shielding is concerned, the way I would think of that is our logical air gapping I talked about, right? So the backups themselves are not available on the network. And if you want to have a recovery posture which could expand any location, physical or virtual or otherwise, then yes, mirroring or replication would be the way that you would deliver that. So yeah, in a backup context, that's exactly what's happening, Steve.
All right, our next question was asked by Matt. Matt says, has your infrastructure been targeted by ransomware attackers? And if so, how have you successfully defended your infrastructure against those attacks?
Certainly has been, and again, I encourage everyone to go to the website so you can see the proof points. Again, that's rubrik.com/ransomware. So you can read firsthand how that happened. The other thing I would encourage you to do is do a search for ESG and Rubrik. And they wrote a great white paper on Rubrik's architecture for responding defensively to a ransomware attack. It actually walks you through the tactical elements of recovery as well. But yes, it's happened, right? Our architecture is such that, we've closed every door, right? But we need the end user, we need the customer to be a part of that dialogue as well as the part of that activity. We've learned a lot along the way, Matt. And one of the things we've learned is that we can't leave an implementation until we signed off on the fact that all of those best practice controls are implemented. Our biggest exposure in our architecture is not the data itself, it's the authentication, right? And it's the expiration control. It's what happens when they're in the Rubrik system. Because if things like retention lock aren't enabled, right? If our best practices as it relates to securing NTP, as well as multi-factor authentication, right? And even things like, sharding your administrative passwords across a few different administrators so no one person has the keys to the kingdom. If you're doing all those things, then you are absolutely impervious to any kind of attack vector. But where we've seen companies fall down, even with a platform like Rubrik, is the data was safe, but because their username and password was not protected with MFA, it lived in a password safe that got compromised, and they didn't have retention lock enabled. Folks logged in, they were able to expire our snapshots. So you've got to employ all of those controls, and we won't leave your site until they are, right? And we would want to get it in writing if you're saying, hey, we're not going to implement those. I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to, but you kind of get the idea. Is there is a place where the company and the user have to have such policies that they implement all of the controls. If that's done, Matt, no way your Rubrik snapshots are not recoverable.
Excellent. Well, Jason, that seems to be about all the time that we've had today. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Most welcome.
Any questions that we did not address today, we will send those over to the folks at Rubrik, and they'll get those answered for you after the webinar concludes. I'd also like to give you a quick reminder that today's session was recorded. Following the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. And you can also find the recording living on the Security Boulevard website. So just visit securityboulevard.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. Now on to our 4 winners of our $25 gift card drawing. Our first winner is Dennis D. Our second winner is Ruslan B. Our third winner is Raja C. And our fourth winner is Jennifer F. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. Jason, again, thank you so much for taking the time to put together this program
My
and
pleasure.
demo. Do you have any final remarks before we officially close out for the day?
Cody, I want to thank you for helping me navigate the webinar. I really, really appreciate it. It's been great to get to know you, and everybody for attending. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. No matter what you do, no matter what road you go down, whatever product choice you make, I really encourage you to just look at all of those controls and make sure you've got a plan to address them. And please, 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 like anything else, practice makes perfect. Tabletop the exercises, go through these things, make sure that you can defensively say, if this happens to us, we've got a plan. And thanks again, and have a great rest of the week.
Excellent. Thank you. Likewise, Jason. Pleasure meeting you. I'd also like to thank our audience for being with us for the entirety of today's presentation. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Everybody have a great day.
Bye-bye.